Hello, good morning. So, as you may have guessed from the title, this is a subject that's going to get me cancelled. I've tried to record this video 4 or 5 times already in the last few days, and I get too enraged every time, so I've deleted every single one. I'm going to try and keep my cool, keep calm and collected, and try and talk about this in... It's not an objective. It's not going to be objective, but I'm going to try and talk about it in a calm manner so that I come across as not crazy. I want to talk about women's rights and transgender rights and being a TERF, because I am one. So I want to first say I got told I was a TERF, and I've been told that I should identify as a TERF and that I am a TERF, etc., etc. Quite a few times through my university time. I am a radical feminist, absolutely, 100%. I am a radical feminist. Do I want to exclude trans people? No. Do I think women's rights and the debates that women are having are separate and very different subject matter than transgender issues, and therefore necessarily excludes transgender women from the debates? Yes. In the majority of cases, yes. I do think that they're different issues, and in a lot of cases they are. Don't get me wrong, there is definitely overlap, there is definitely subject matter, that you could collaborate together on, for sure. There's definitely stuff. My lips look so dry. There's definitely stuff that we could all come together on, as well as like LGBT, etc. There are definitely some things, just that if you're disenfranchised, if you are a minority, if you are vulnerable, you can come together on a lot of issues, right? So that's not my issue. I'm not saying I'm not saying segregate women and trans women or anything like. That's not what I'm saying. But for example, lesbian women, they have a different experience to straight women, right? And so necessarily they have their own spaces to talk about, specific stuff. What's wrong with that? Nothing. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And okay, so what I'm going to talk about now is I'm going to directly address the Transgender Bill. There was going to be an amendment made, or it was proposed that various amendments were made to the Gender Act, I believe, or Gender Discrimination Act, maybe, which was created in 2010, I think, and that kind of gave the outline of identify, if you want to transition to become a different gender and you want to identify as a different gender, it gave you the rules for doing that. Now, there is one rule I don't agree with, because it's exclusionary on the basis of economic status, and that is that transgender people have to pay £140 for their registration to be a different gender. I don't think that's fair. No one else is made to pay for that kind of a thing, for anything even close to that. NHS is meant to be covering that kind of stuff. You know, in the same way that if you were low income and you couldn't afford to pay for your prescriptions, let's say, you should get them covered, you know, on the NHS. Not covered, because NHS prescriptions aren't covered for many people at all. But, you know, there's ways of getting around it. You can get a certificate so that you only pay like a particular amount, a particular fee per year, and then that's it, rather than paying over and over and over again for expensive repeat prescriptions and stuff. So the £140 for the registration, I don't agree with that. But that's the Marxist in me, you know. Other than that, though, it asks that you, not asks, it requires that you are registered and under treatment with a doctor. I'll come back around on that. So these are the rules as they were. 2 years under a doctor, and some of the doctors in the UK that you could be registered under as that for that 2-year transition period, some of them, the Tories are saying, are the way I saw it covered in the news was quack doctors could no longer be one of those doctors that you register with throughout that transition period. I don't know what they're referring to there. I should have done research before again. I'm not entirely sure who they're talking about. But I listened to Blair White on this, right? She is a transgender woman who has transitioned to be a woman. She passes as a gorgeous woman. Let me tell you, as a bi woman, she's a gorgeous woman. You wouldn't know at all. Maybe you would maybe you'd guess after a long old time, but honestly, I don't think you would know, right? What was my point? What's my point here? Yeah. So, you are dealing with a mental health issue, gender dysphoria, right? And the majority of trans people are people who suffer from that. And they really struggle with that. And so the doctors say it would actually be better for your mental health, maybe, if you transition to be that, so that your brain, just so that you're not so fucking distressed looking in a mirror every day or whatever, you know? Because imagine that, like hating looking at yourself. I mean, I'm sure everyone can imagine that to some extent. But, you know, that's what you're dealing with, right? So should you be under a proper doctor for that? Probably, yeah. I would want to know that you're getting good treatment. That's, for me, that would be really, really key. You know, if you're struggling like that, I'd want to know that you're getting proper, good professional care. I don't see anything wrong with that as an amendment. What they were proposing to do is take on a Canada-style gender identification thing where you can just self-identify. There's no process. There's no going to a doctor. There's no 2 years. There's no nothing. You can just identify as something else. And there was a lot of pushback about that. And obviously that's what's been announced the last few days, is that's not going to happen. They're not going to make it easier to self-identify, and personally I don't see a problem with that. So this is why I'm a TERF, is because I see them as separate issues, and I remind people a lot that being transgender is actually gender dysphoria. And that is what transgenderism is, what this non-binary stuff is, and all of that. I couldn't be sure. I think that's just generally, from the people that I've met, it's just people who don't have it hard enough. And they don't like their gender. They don't like that gender dictates how you should act in any way. They don't like the idea of performative gender is essentially what they're rebelling against. But do I think that should be recognised in law? No, because it's nonsensical, and the thing is, there's no consensus from the people who identify as that as to what that actually means. So you can't have that supported in law. You just can't. No, I'll go on to that another day, because that's a whole nother story time. About like, no, I'll go into it another time. So yeah, I don't know about the non-binary stuff. I don't really want to address that right now. Again, I've got more that I could probably talk about with that. But being a TERF, let's talk about that for a little minute. And the shit that I've had for being a TERF whilst at uni. So yeah, like I say, I'm a radical feminist, and radical feminism is, in theory, like the theory of radical feminism, the academia behind it is absolutely rooted in the exclusion of men and in the solidarity of women. It absolutely is based in Judith Butler, for example. All she talks about is gender being performative, and how you are conditioned from day dot to be a woman, whatever that may mean in your culture, right? But it is from being born that you are conditioned into that. If that is the theoretical framework that you're working with radical feminism, how can transgenderism work in that? How? If it's about having performed that gender and learnt to behave in particular ways because of how people perceive you, how can someone who identifies as a woman but has a penis and has grown up as a person with a penis, how can that fit in? Theoretically, genuinely, within the theoretical framework, how can that physically fit in? It can't. So radical feminists are exclusionary of transgender issues, but because the theoretical framework is necessarily that. It's not a case of I don't support transgender women. It's a case of my theoretical framework cannot allow for that. It just can't. And that shouldn't get you cancelled. That shouldn't get you into lawsuits. That is how the theory works. And that's what you're working with. as a radical feminist, you're working within a theoretical framework that just doesn't account for transgender women. It just can't, right? That doesn't mean that I don't think transgender rights are an issue that need to be dealt with. I think they are. You know, like, I don't want anyone excluded or made to feel vulnerable or made to feel any type of way for being who they are, right? But what a transgender woman deals with in her daily life is very different to what I deal with in my daily life. Even as someone who gets asked if they're a man on quite a regular basis, literally, especially in like gay village, I've had people come up to me thinking that I am trans, right? And looking for a trans person. But I've never dealt with having to transition. I've never dealt with having to, like, grow up one gender and then want to be another one. And neither have most women, because it's not a woman's issue. It's a transgender woman's issue. Doesn't discount it, doesn't invalidate it, doesn't make it lesser. It just makes it different to women's issues. And needing its own specialist, you know, investigation and sort of support. I've seen the same with regard to women's refuges, transgender women saying it's not fair that they're not allowed in. As a woman who has been through some bad stuff with some men, particularly one, I couldn't be around men for months and months. I couldn't comfortably be within 3 meters of one, right? So women's spaces do need to feel like women's spaces at all times. If you're Blair White, I'm not, for example, you're a transgender woman like Blair White, I'm not going to feel threatened in any way with a Blair White in a woman's space. So wouldn't challenge that at any point. If a Jessica Yaniv walked in, I would feel like a man was in my woman's space. And I think that's the kind of things that TERFs are dealing with at the moment. And it seems to be that women's spaces are the ones that are being taken away. And it's not like there's being anything put in place alongside. It's just women's spaces are being taken away and made unisex. For example, at university, the majority of women's toilets that I was using throughout the university campus in year 1, by the time I left 2 years later, the majority of those were unisex toilets, and there had been no woman's toilet put anywhere else instead. There's nothing wrong with being more inclusive, but make sure that there are still spaces for women, because we fought fucking hard to get women's spaces, and now they seem to have disappeared overnight. And I don't see what's wrong with wanting to keep those. Again, just quickly back on the women's issues versus trans issues, they are separate issues. Blair White again talks about these. I'll put a link to her YouTube channel as well, so you can go and have a look. But trans women can't have periods, right? They don't get pap smears. They don't. They won't get mammograms, I imagine. Do they? Do men get mammograms when they're old? Should they? Oh, I don't know. Anyway, something else. But all very different things. right? So yeah, I'm obviously going to get cancelled before starting just by saying that, but that's what I think. And yeah, I just feel like not enough women are feeling comfortable with saying anything even close to that. I mean, I have for sure been excluded, like socially excluded, because of being a TERF. Mainly, by middle class liberal groups at university, so no loss for me, to be honest. But no, it was my social life at uni kind of, yeah. But yeah, I'll talk about this final last thing to do with being a TERF, and how someone basically accused me of being a terrorist or being aligned with terrorists just from being a TERF. Now, bear in mind, a TERF that's a term that has been made up quite clearly by people who don't understand radical feminism. Because radical feminism is exclusionary of trans rights by nature. So you can't be a trans exclusionary radical feminist. You can just be a radical feminist. That's it. So either you are a radical feminist or you're a bourgeois feminist, which is what is taking over at the moment and wants to include everyone but get nowhere with their demands. I'll talk about that again another time. But I was having a conversation with someone. We were both drunk. It was after a uni meeting. He's LGBT, I am too. I can't remember what we were talking about, but something along those lines, LGBT themed, right? And he said, oh yeah, well, what about them TERFs though? So obviously, the way it came up, he had obviously, like, someone else that I speak to had obviously told him this, my secret that I'm a TERF. Like, oh no, I hope I don't get found out. Like, never tried to hide any of my opinions from anyone, but yeah, there was this sense that I should be ashamed of it. I'm not. So he went, oh yeah, what about them TERFs though? Something like that was like, okay. And I said, oh yeah, no, that's me. I am one of them, apparently. And we got into a bit of a conversation, and I said what I said, just basically a shorter version of what I've just said here. But less clear because I was drunk-ish. Maybe, I don't know, I can't remember, not properly. And then he said to me, well, have you heard about these TERFs that are going around putting up posters that have razors on that are meant to be like trying to bait transgender people into hurting themselves, into like maiming themselves? You're making me speak about something that I've never heard about. Can't find about it anywhere either, so it's clearly a load of shit. But you're making me explain based on my feminist approach, like a theory that I believe in, That's what we're talking about. Words that I believe in, that I agree with. Because I agree with those words, you're making me justify trying to terrorize and maim transgender people, a vulnerable group. Because I think a particular theory, you're making me explain what I think about terrorist acts. In what world does that make sense? In what world? That's exactly the same as when all Muslims have to condemn a terrorist act by a supposed Muslim. Just because they say that they're using that ideology doesn't mean that they are representative of that ideology. Do you know what I mean? In fact, it's it was a false equivalency, but I won't go into why it was. But yeah, so because I think in line with a particular theory, you're making me explain why I condemn people going around trying to get transgender people maimed for the rest of their life. How is that fair? And it just shows that it's definitely not actually about disagreeing with the theory. That's clearly not what it is. Because if it was that, that's what you would challenge me on. Instead, you bring up some bullshit event that I have to try and disavow. Why? I think at the time I said that's like trying to make straight people, that's like identifying all straight people with them people that, do you know when HIV started coming out and some people put needles with HIV in places and people got stabbed and got HIV or whatever, or that was the plan. Do you remember that? I said that's the same. So did you equate all straight people with that, with those people who were doing that? Because they were homophobic attacks, right? So what, all heterosexual people were the same as that then? Because that's what you're saying. That's